Eager to get past the Andrew Johnson years, the American public was looking for a new hero in the form of a president. And in the election of 1868, the Republicans nominated Ulysses S Grant, the hero of the Union cause of the Civil War. Well, Ulysses S Grant doesn't have any political experience. He's just a really popular guy because, well, he delivered a victory in the Civil War for the Union cause. Great, right? Um, and that was deemed as Republicans as being the bulwark of momentum for effective Reconstruction processes. Okay? And Ulysses S. Grant supported much of the Reconstruction efforts. Okay? Obviously, he literally fought to retain the South as part of our Union. But in this particular instance, now, as president, he would now help to initiate the idea of having 500,000 black Republican voters from the South largely, and others who can galvanize a cause to help move forward with Reconstruction efforts. Okay? The problem with Grant, in that not having political experience so far as concerned, he didn't always pick the best advisors. Oftentimes he would surround himself with his friends or even family members. And he would appoint ineffective cabinet members and advisors, and oftentimes his most devoted supporters would receive advantageous positions or contracts or otherwise. That's severe patronage. Okay? So the idea of a spoils system, you're going to give favor to people who are politically aligned with you or to your friends or anything else of the sort and make things potentially lucrative for them. That's a spoils system that serves as the backdrop of the Grant administration during his entire tenure. Okay? So you have various different people and advisors that would eventually come back to bite him because people would catch on to his spoils system and spoils nature of his presidency. And these advisors that we had weren't often making good decisions in the first place either, too. So you have kind of a compounded aspect to it. And there were other Republicans, people within his own political party, even though he didn't have political experience, who didn't see him as extending protections of black people far enough. And when in combination with the spoils system that he had implemented by placing his friends into the cabinet and otherwise, he fell under scrutiny among various different liberal wings of the Republican Party who wanted to oust him. They saw him as being an ineffective president. He wasn't going and leaning towards the Reconstruction cause far enough, and he was kind of corrupt in various different ways, or at least people in his cabinet were. So there were people who, by the time the next election rolled around in 1872, people within his own party who wanted him out, and obviously the Democrats wanted him out. But despite opposition from his own party and the Democrats putting forth their nomination, he was able to eke out a victory in 1872 and remain president for a second term. Okay, he kind of fell under further scrutiny when another scandal took place when the financial company in construction company Credit Mobilier, who built railroads, was deemed as basically obtaining fraudulent contracts to build various different railroad works in the United States. Various different stockholders within Union Pacific would be able to kind of make bribes, if you will, for contract negotiation that were obtained fraudulently. And various different people within his organization were offered stock in Union Pacific who was trying to buy more fraudulent contracts to cook the books, if you will. So that kind of stained his presidency when people in his cabinet were deemed as being crooks. Okay, they were accepting bribes for fraudulent contracts, for railroad scandals and whatnot, including various different post traders as well, too, in and involved in and around that. So you have a lot of different bribes. You have this spoils system. You have a lack of political experience and people put into place making key decisions with very little knowledge or bad advice. The Grant presidency was pockmarked with scandal. Okay? In the scheme of things, it's not great, but it's definitely kind of crooked. You have favoritism, spoils system, cronyism, and fraud. Okay? And it all kind of went under, especially when Grant may or may not have known about everything else going on too. Okay? Now, there was also a financial downturn during his presidency in 1873 when a major investment banking firm had invested too heavily in some railroad construction and post-war railroad building. They weren't anywhere near as profitable as thought, and the whole entirety of it kind of sank the entire economy down. It's kind of like what happened in 2008. The idea of the government needing to bail out companies that are, quote unquote, too big to fail. AIG being one of them. AIG, the insurance company, received $85 billion in 2008 so as to salvage their company. Reason being is if all of their net worth and assets crumble, that could severely drag the financial sector down, which had already been hampered with mortgage debt and the mortgage crisis of 2008. So from that perspective, federal government had to bail them out because they were too big to fail. Same thing with these major auto manufacturers, General Motors and Ford Motor Company, taking bailouts from the federal government because they were too big to fail. They could drag the entire system down. That's kind of what happened with this investment firm in the Panic of 1873 with that economic downturn. And that kind of put a damper on Grant's presidency, especially because you had a continuing argument about government specie, money. Okay, so the idea of there being collateral for printed money was now also thrown under question. What sort of currency should the United States back for everything it prints for its dollars? The idea of a greenback, a $1 bill, backside being green, mind you, being based upon the value of specie, in this case gold, really comes to the forefront around this time. Especially if you have various different companies that could potentially go under, you need to have various different collateral that you can use to base your currency off of that would be deemed as being better for the resumption of printing money in the event of debt or indebtedness. So what you see today in 2020, you have various different politicians talking about stimulus and things along those lines. The Federal Reserve is very likely going to start printing more money. If you've ever seen those old reels of like $100 bills being printed by the Treasury, it's fun to watch. That's actually going to need to happen again. The government's going to need to flood the economy with money because in a long-term economic down situation, things are going to be made plenty worse if there's not more spending. You need to get money into the hands of people. People spend money. And when people spend money, money gets recirculated about 5 or 6 times. So, with that perspective, the government needs to crank out more dollars so as to get money into the hands of people. Well, in this case, in the 1870s, there needed to have been a reprinting of old money and a further continuation of pumping money into the U.S. economy, thereby expanding the amount of paper currency available, but then also basing it off gold to improve its value. Okay, so you would have a resumption of debt payment and otherwise based on gold being the money supply collateral, if that makes sense. Okay, so that all happened under Grant's administration. Um, and then other course things also happened in Grant's administration. You have various different Reconstruction politicians um, that negotiated the acquisition of Alaska from the Russians. So there was a joke that came out in the 2008 campaign. Sarah Palin, the vice presidential candidate with John McCain, she's former governor of Alaska. And there are various different Saturday Night Live skits where Tina Fey would talk about, I can see Russia from my house, as an impersonation of Sarah Palin. Yeah, if you look at a map, yeah, Alaska's right next to Russia. Well, Alaska used to be a semi existing Russian territory, even though they technically don't connect. That's the former land bridge that we talked about in the very first few days of this class. Okay. Um, the United States was able to annex Russia or Alaska from Russia for a little over $7 million. Even though there was a lot of criticism for it, the United States was able to expand territorially. We also were able to obtain islands in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, the Midway Islands, midway between Hawaii and Japan. Okay, so thereby giving us various different territories out in the Pacific as well. So you have a little bit of an expansion, and in this case with Alaska, it's a big expansion. Just not many people there because it's real cold. Otherwise, though, you have various other different things that go on with England to renegotiate some old Civil War misfits, if you will. Supposedly, the British government, Parliament, basically violated neutrality acts by helping build ships for the Confederacy. Okay, so that was settled in the Grant era. Otherwise, the Grant era was stained with cronyism, the spoils system, fraud, weakness, inexperience, and then putting people in office making decisions that really shouldn't be there. And of course, an economic downturn, which caused a reevaluation of currency. So that was the Ulysses S Grant era.